February was a bit of a wild ride here in the Ocean City market. And in today's video, I want to take you through everything that happened, a little bit of that peak and valley that I explained in last week's video with the mortgage rates, as well as to give you some updates as to what we've seen so far here in March so that we can project what to expect going forward so that you have actionable information to do with as you choose. Now, before we get into all of the charts that you've come to know and love, I want to get this out of the way. One of the questions I've been getting the most recently is what is going to happen if rates don't come down? And again, we talked about that a good chunk in last week's video, which I will have linked down in the description. But I want to unwind that a little bit because what we saw in February, which again, we'll detail here in a minute, does not give me any reason to believe that we should expect a shift in pricing in any capacity. The demand is still there, even though we haven't quite seen it in this first week in March. We've had garbage weather, and it's kept people away. So in short, do not expect prices to come down, even with rates going up. There are still plenty of buyers out there, still people taking action on the right properties. So the only thing that does mean if you're looking to buy is that if you're open to buying what I'll just say a subpar property, and I don't mean any offense by that, but something that's not in a prime location, that's not in prime condition, right? Needs some updating. There's a possibility that you may be able to secure yourself something that resembles a good value over the coming couple months. So let's get into the figures and charts. So mortgage rates, again, last week we talked about it at length, but the short version is we saw them jack up throughout the first half of February, or rather the last 2 weeks in February. What we've seen so far in the first week of March is that they've actually come back down pretty much everything that they have gone up. So what remains to be seen, and I've been saying this for months now, right? We shouldn't expect rates to come down from where they were at the beginning of the year. That should maybe happen if it happens in the second half of 2024. And we can't lose sight of that. We're going to see some moderation and changing up and down over the coming weeks and months, but nothing material, nothing that should change your mind as to what you're going to do here. Now, inventory, we finally saw our first increase, which we normally see in February. And now as of March 6th, which is yesterday, we bumped up a good chunk up to 253. We had a very strong first week in terms of new listings, which we'll get to here in a minute. You're not going to see it on the chart for March, but we will talk about it. So it's a good sign. It's a step in the right direction, which again is going to seem jarring compared to what limited inventory we had been seeing. But 23 new listings in the first week of March. If we run that out over the roughly 4 weeks there in every month, that's going to get us close to 100 listings, which is about what we expect based off of what we've seen in March's past. So days on market still very stable. Prices increasing even more so for condos, and we will get to that and why. And then down for single families. Now, if you've been paying attention to these charts, you would have maybe remembered that the last time we saw this, it was a 6% year-over-year decrease, right? We dropped 6% from where we were last year. 9% is obviously heading in the wrong direction, but that is strictly because of the way that we look at this on a 12-month rolling average. We had a huge month that's going to drop off here when we get to the end of March. It's going to make this number go back up. And we're actually going to see a very low number next month, 999,000, well below the average. That's going to change that as well in the future. So again, don't read too much into that number. Don't expect things to be plummeting or dropping. I wanted to get that so that you fully understand. Now, new listings, we see this increase right over the last 2 months. This going from the valley, now it looks like we're peaking. If you want to pause and look at this, you can. That happens at the beginning of every year. Every January, February, we see new listings increase. Now, last year we saw increase January up to about 90, and then it stayed flat for February and March. We didn't see that this year just because we were short in January, but we hit our target in February, and we're on pace so far in March to hit our target. So again, I think we are back on track. I expect us to stay in a pretty balanced and stable market, and we should still see new listings coming. Way less than we used to, right? If we look all the way back at the beginning of this chart, January 2019, we saw almost 200 new listings. Now we're getting all hot and bothered and excited when we see 100. Not the same situation. So there's a reason, again, if you were looking back then, why it doesn't feel the same now, but this is the world we have. We have to adjust. Pending sales, identical number, 46 pending sales last February in 2022, as we had in this, 2023, as we saw this February 2024. So once again, another indicator pointing us in the right direction that we're in a good, stable situation. Again, it's a volatile, stable situation, if that makes sense, volatile and stable at the same time, but volatile in very small, nuanced ways, but stable across the board. Now, sold again, about the same as we saw last February, nothing to write home about. We're starting to see this trend continue of what we had over the past 2 years. Now, we did see a spike in single family inventory, which made this jump back up our months of inventory back to roughly 6 months of inventory, which is once again a stable market. If you're hearing me say the word stable a million times, there's a reason for that. Price wise, again, we're stabilizing right around that 1.5 to 1.6 million that I've been talking about for the better part of the last 6 months. That's where we should stay and expect to see for the foreseeable future. Days on market jumping up a little bit. Now for condos, it's more of the same. We've had pretty consistent months of inventory for the better part of the last 2 years, hovering around that 4 months of inventory. So again, there's a reason why prices have continued to stay strong, to continue inching upwards, which we're going to again see here on the next slide, versus the single family world where inventory has gone up a little bit. So again, we have our second consecutive pretty reasonable jump. Now, I don't expect this trajectory to stay forever. We're not going to keep increasing at a 15 to 16% pace year over year. That should start to flatten out pretty quickly, I think. I don't anticipate that we will be exceeding 900,000 by the end of this year, but we shall see. So last but not least, once we get past days on market, we're going to talk about the future here. And again, from a March standpoint, now that we have a week in and a week, we're not going to read too much into, but we are going to take what hints and breadcrumbs we can find to help inform how we view things going forwards. So mortgage rates, again, did spike. They came back down. And if we were to look at those on a chart, that happens multiple times, and it happens routinely over the past few Februaries. It has happened the last 3 Februaries where we have peaked in February, come back down. Now, the difference over the past 2 Februaries is that after that come back down, they have increased again. Again, I don't anticipate that to be the case, unless, like we talked about in last week's video, again, linked down below if you want to check it out. That will only happen if the Fed does not cut rates at all this year. And then I would expect rates to creep back up above 7 and to probably stay there. The only thing that brought them back down from the mid to high 7s where we were in the fall was the expectation that rates were going to be cut at least 3 times in 2024. So if that unravels, which we won't know for another few months, at least for the first expected cut in June, we just have to hope and cross our fingers that that is not going to be the case, that the inflation data doesn't make them change their course or expected course. But time will tell. Now, for inventory, again, we had a pretty standard February. Yes, we saw a big increase in new listings from January, but that's because January was low. February was what we expected it to be, right under 90. March on pace for it to be about what we expect it to be, between 90 and 100. We'll see where we land by the end of the month, but so far it looks good. Now, one little anomaly, and I think it has to do everything with the weather, and I promised I would talk about this. The first week, we initially, as of yesterday, only saw 1 home go under contract in the first 6 days of March, which is incredibly low. We did see 2 more now that I just saw this morning, up to 3, still incredibly low. Now, I'm not reading into that at all, and here's why. We saw the exact same thing over the first 2 weeks in February, a pretty weak first 2 weeks in February. The weather wasn't great. Admittedly, the beginning of February is usually slower than the second half anyway. So I'm not worried about it at this point. Every weekend has been a washout, at least one or both days for the past 2 to 3 weeks. So it's going to happen. So I'm not shocked. We have another rain day coming up on Saturday. We'll see if that keeps people away again. All that will do, in my opinion, is backload things again like we saw in February. So again, as I talk about this throughout the month, I'm going to continue to point that out. The inventory should continue to grow. Now, I do think that we will end up somewhere in the 270 to 275 range by the end of the month. We're already sitting at, again, low 250s as of yesterday, where we stand. So it's a delicate balance, but there's still strong demand. There are a couple homes who I know have had multiple offers within a couple days of being on the market. And a lot of those not in prime locations, not priced incredibly low, right? Not underpriced. It's just happened. So there are still enough real and hungry buyers out there, and that's all we need. Again, I tell people who come to me and say, well, I'm not buying, or no one I know is buying. I wouldn't pay what these people are asking. The goal of the free market is to price these homes at a point where we don't need 100 people to be interested in that home and willing to pay what we're asking for that home. You need the one who's willing to pay the most. That's the reality of buying a home that people don't want to acknowledge, right? Fear as a buyer is you're going to overpay. If you think of it from a different perspective, you're not going to like this, but I tell it to people anyway. That's the only way you end up buying the home. You're the one who was willing to pay more than everybody else was willing to pay. So don't think of it as a bad thing. And we're never going to encourage anyone, and especially me, I'm never going to encourage you to knowingly overpay for anything. We're going to look at the comps. We're going to talk things through carefully. And it depends on how motivated you are to buy that particular home, coupled with how motivated the seller is to sell that particular home. Everything is nuanced and every situation is different. But the only way you buy a home here in Ocean City is if you paid more than everybody else. So please let that sink in, because that is a huge hurdle that most people never get past. The stat, again, I reference time and time again, is only 10% of the people who want to buy here ever do. And that's the holdup primarily. And yes, it is very expensive to buy and own here. That's just the reality. So if you want that dream to become your reality, you have to get past that mental hurdle. And again, we don't overpay intentionally, but you do have to be the one who is willing to pay the most if you want to buy that home or buy a home here on the island. So price-wise, again, single families were leveled out. There are still some very high-end homes selling very quickly. There are still plenty of lower-end homes that are also selling for the most part, but there's a lot that have just been sitting out there, especially in the single-family world. Back in my old neighborhood in Marion Park, only one has sold. There have been plenty that have been listed over the past almost 6 months at this point. So there are not as many, I'll say, year-round locals buying. That's primarily a neighborhood for those folks. And that tends to be because we're the most rate and price sensitive. One of the realities of living here in a second home, where people come down with the money to buy a second home, we're trying to buy our first or stay here. So there are pockets where homes are not selling for whatever reason. And sometimes it's condition, sometimes it's price, sometimes it's location. But all things considered, there's enough happening at both ends, and more activity, in my opinion, happening at both ends of the price spectrum, not as much happening in the middle. That's a much harder pocket for people because those are typically the move up buyers. Those are the ones who have something to sell, are looking for the extra bedroom. Those people can't or don't want to go from the 2.5, 3.5% mortgage rate that they have here to a 6, to a 6.5, to a 7, whatever it may be. So very, very micro markets within this market right now. And it can be very confusing. So if you want to talk through any of that, don't hesitate to reach out whatsoever, because all that context matters. If you're going to say, I've seen a lot of price drops, well, I'm going to respond and say, well, in what price range, right? At what price point? Because each one is acting a little bit differently. Buyers are acting a little bit differently. So we need to pay attention to that stuff. Now, inventory should continue to increase. I do think that will generally be the case through May. I think we will see the big increase now. It'll creep up a little bit more in April and May. And then we normally see things come off the market for summertime. And then we see another peak, I'll say, in fall before it plummets again in the winter. So normal seasonality trends are coming back. So again, that's what I'm basing these projections off of. And I feel pretty good and confident that that's going to be the case. Days on market again is really fine in both pockets. So you have to be ready to act quickly. Now, to wrap this up, I want to talk through the normal buyer's approach right now, and whether this is where you're at mentally or whether you're selling and not understanding why your home is sitting the way that it's sitting. So buyers, for the most part, unless it is priced appropriately, and appropriately means at or under slightly what the comps say. That's how pricing a home properly works. As much as every seller wants to shoot for a little bit more, right, than the neighbors, or feel that their home is worth a little bit more, or feel the market has gone up more since the last one sold, it's possible. But the homes that are selling quickly and the buyers react to homes that are priced properly and appropriately, the ones that are sitting are the ones where we stretched a little bit, right? We reached a little higher than we thought was reasonable just because we wanted to see how the market responded. So buyers, for the most part, have gotten used to that. They understand that at that stretch price, they would rather sit on the sidelines for 2 to 3 weeks and watch it and see what happens. 2 listings that we have going right now are in that category where we priced it at the slight stretch number, had good showing activity, good feedback, everything came back that we were just priced a little bit high. We've dropped price on both of those. We're getting more activity again. And the urgency is just different from the buyers that are reaching out, the buyers agents that are reaching out, because they know that we are now priced appropriately, or more appropriately, I should say. So if you're a buyer and you see something that is interesting, I would encourage you to obviously go check it out ASAP. I would not sit on the sidelines and wait until you see the price reduction, because sometimes that never happens. And how often it's handled is, if a buyer came through and expressed interest, but the feedback was it's just priced too high, right? Too high and not okay for us to make an offer because, we don't want to insult you. We think we're too far apart, whatever it is. More often than not, and this doesn't happen every time, but you need to know this. If, let's just say I have a listing, we don't get any offers. We talk with the sellers about, all right, it's time, right? The market has spoken. Here's what the feedback was. Here's the showing activity. We need to reduce the price by X% or X dollars. Before we do that, let's give these buyers who came through, whose feedback was that it was just priced a little bit too high, let's give them the opportunity, right? Hey, we are going to drop the price to blank. If you're interested, right, you've got a day or two to take a shot before we make it public. That not only creates a sense of urgency with buyers again, but it also, I would say, rewards the people who are out there being active versus sitting on the sidelines. The ones who have already done the due diligence and are more ready to go, they tend to be the more motivated buyers, the more excited buyers. So if you're a buyer, I would encourage you to keep that in mind. It's always worth seeing something. It's always worth taking a shot at something, because you don't know what opportunities that's going to bring down the road. So being active is important. So wanted to wrap it up with that. Thank you as always for hanging out with me. And if you haven't already, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe so that you get notified when I come out with these videos each and every week, specific to the market in Ocean City. So thanks again. I'll see you next time.